Are we waiting for John, or are we going to go?
So go ahead and get started. That way we're not delayed too much further than
okay.
we have been.
Just want to start by saying that since we last met, I've been ill the whole time. So I'm just recovering my voice. Having lost it for about 3 days, so it might give up or give out rather during this. So I'm sorry for being croaky. So I chose to talk about this week for my introduction because, as you may remember from the first week of the with the introductions, that I'm a curator and I work and I have for many years run art galleries, so and curated art galleries. So this is a week that's of particular interest to me. Having said that, I'm actually, for my introduction, not really going to talk about arts or aesthetics or anything that comes out of the text so directly. Because maybe that can come up in the discussion, but I think it's because I wanted, to talk about something that came up last week, and to pick up on some stuff from Ryan's introduction from week 4, I think, and think about this idea of ecologies of ecologies, which is something that Ryan mentioned that he'd drawn out of that week's readings. So it's thinking about the idea of the weave, which is another thing that came out of Ryan's introduction, and talking about how we can move within the weave and consider the gaps within this as a system or a structure. So thinking about weaves got me thinking about threads, and looking at this week's reading, I was really taken by Nora Bateson's Rain and how she describes the unbounded threads in this really beautiful poem, which is very sad and romantic and quite kind of quite intense as a sort of series of emotions, where she talks about the unbounded threads sort of coming apart, and then the sort of process of them coming back together into this weave through a process of what she describes as denouement. So thinking about how this week's readings come together with this idea of the weave and threads, and a sort of how we are internally patterned, and how we are also part of the larger patterned world, and how these primary processes, which both the Batesons describe in relation to art, as Gregory Bateson does, and how Nora does in relation to, actually how both of them do actually, when talking about sort of plural selves and multiple sort of existences, more selves, So, and this is a kind of a psychic integration, where they're kind of coming apart of these threads and then the weaving back together of these kind of constituents, relata. I wasn't familiar with the word relata. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but it came up a lot in this week's text by Gregory Bateson. So how these constituent parts are threaded back together, and how it's only through that conjunction that these things have an ability to make a profound sense. So given this discussion of a weave and particularly Gregory Bateson's focus this week on layering of consciousness in terms of the primary and secondary functions, I can't remember what the word is he uses, but the primary and secondary processes, that's it, of consciousness. I wanted to bring in Donna Haraway, who comes from the science of consciousness, so the study of consciousness, and feminism, obviously. So I wanted to bring her in partly because Geoffrey asked me to talk about ecofeminism. However, I've decided in the intervening week that ecofeminism is not the right word, even though I used it last week. Ecofeminism has a very specific point in feminist history anyway, which actually is reasonably controversial in terms of its essentialism, particularly in regards to gender dichotomies. So I wanted to think about a feminism that's more intersectional and also interspecies. Hence why I want to talk about Haraway. Sorry, excuse me. So this seems like a appropriate point to talk about Haraway and Gregory Bateson and Nora Bateson together. So I thought as a way to do this, I might just read a little bit from Haraway's most recent book, Staying with the Trouble, where she talks about string and string figures. So by string figures, she means what we in the UK certainly call cat's cradles. So the making of a string figure in your hands, which is then through a process of specific movements passed on to someone else. I assume that this is a fairly common children's game that you probably know. She talks about the idea of multispecies. Well, I wanted to talk about the idea through Haraway of multispecies knowledge and complexity, of being with and making kin. So I'm just going to read a bit. My voice might give out. I'm just going to kind of read this bit and then maybe we can talk about the reading and it in relation to it. So this is from the introduction to Staying with the Trouble. Oh no, sorry, it's from chapter 1. Sorry. Okay. It's probably just 2 or 3 minutes worth of text. So she says, string figures are like stories. They propose and enact patterns for participants to inhabit, somehow on a vulnerable and wounded earth. My multi-species storytelling is about recuperation in complex histories that are as full of dying as living, as full of endings, even genocides as beginnings. In the face of unrelenting, historically specific surplus suffering in companion species knottings, I am not interested in reconciliation or restoration, but I am deeply committed to the more modest possibilities of partial recuperation and getting on together. I call that staying with the trouble. And so I look for real stories that are also speculative fabulations and speculative realisms. These are stories in which multi-species players who are enmeshed in partial and flawed translations across difference redo ways of living and dying attuned to still possible finite flourishing, still possible recuperation. SF is a sign for science fiction, speculative feminism, science fantasy, speculative fabulation, science fact, and also string figures. Playing games of string figures is about giving and receiving patterns, dropping threads and failing, but sometimes finding something that works, something consequential and maybe even beautiful, that wasn't there before, or relaying connections that matter, of telling stories in hand upon hand, digit upon digit, attachment site upon attachment site, to craft conditions for finite flourishing on terra, on earth. String figures require holding still in order to receive and pass on. String figures can be played by many on all sorts of limbs, as long as the rhythm of accepting and giving is sustained. Scholarship and politics are like that too. Passing on is in twists and skeins that require passion and action, holding still and moving, anchoring and launching. And then just a little bit further on, she says, in relay and return, SF morphs in my writing and research into speculative fabulation and string figures. Relays, string figures, passing patterns back and forth, giving and receiving. Patterns holding the unasked for pattern in one's hands. Oops. Giving and receiving, patterning, holding the unasked for pattern in one's hands. Responsibility that is core to what I mean by staying with the trouble in serious multi-species worlds. Becoming with, not becoming, is the name of the game. Becoming with is how partners are rendered capable. Companion species are relentlessly becoming with. The category companion species helps me refuse human exceptionalism without invoking posthumanism. Companion species play string figure games where who is, are, is to be in, of the world, in constituted, in intra and interaction. The partners do not precede the knotting. Species of all kinds are consequent upon worldly subject and object shaping entanglements. In human animal worlds, companion species are ordinary beings in encounter in the house, in the lab, field, in the zoo, park, truck, office, prison, ranch, arena, village, human hospital, forest, slaughterhouse, estuary, vet clinic, lake, stadium, barn, wildlife preserve, farm, ocean canyon, city streets, factory, and more. So, yeah, that's my contribution for the introduction for these texts. I hope that is useful. I'd love to hear what you think.
That's gorgeous, Lucy, and resonates with a lot of things that I'm interested in. So, in fact, I'm sort of it was interesting rereading this chapter because the whole idea of grace is something that fascinates me. One of my science fiction saga books is called Gracia, which is a reformulation of the idea of grace. And I struggled for a long time while I was writing it, trying to figure out what exactly I was trying to say with it, because I'm not quite sure I understand what grace is, even though I've written extensively about it. So, and Gregory Bateson's take on grace is a bit different from the sort of standard ideas about grace, which largely come from Christianity, right? So, or I guess there is a kind of aesthetic grace that one can talk about as well. So I'm going to say about the companion species is also something that I've written extensively about in my science fiction, because it's another thing that really interests me, is how we form relationships with other animal species or plant species, for that matter. So it was lovely to leave in that reference. And of course, string figures. I love cat's cradle. I've always liked cat's cradle, but I can never find anybody to play it with because people don't really know how to do it. So, you know, I do it myself with the standard kind of patterns, but it's hard to do the more complicated ones on your own. you know, you kind of need somebody to be able to reach in and reconfigure things. So it's not something I've done a lot of, because it's just not easy to find people to do it. So lovely connection there. I'll let maybe others speak and come back.
I just want to thank you, Lucy, for bringing Donna Haraway into the conversation. What you read there, really, her words are helping me connect multiple threads right now, of course. And I want to allow the three of you to talk right now. I feel unprepared. Even though I've read the material, I always mention I need time to process. And but Donna Haraway is someone that we have all loosely explored. So I'd like to see how she contributes here today.
Thank you, Lucy, for that reading. I'm sorry I was running late today. I'm a big fan of Donna Haraway's. I remember she said something very provocative. I can't remember. I think it was a lecture I heard of hers, or maybe it was something I read, but she talked about the AIDS virus, and her husband died of AIDS, actually. I believe he was bisexual. I'm not sure about that, but I do remember her talking about the virus, about viruses, and the relationship between the virus and the host. And she thought that there was a myth that the virus is considered to be the agent of change. And she, I thought, reframed that and suggested very strongly that the host is the agent of change, and that the host has invited the virus in to the system. And how we interpret that could vary. I mean, at you know, our egocentric human level, we may say that, you know, that's real stupid. But on another level, these kinds of interplays may be inconvenient, but they may be necessary on some level that we can't possibly grasp at our current very bifurcated kind of way of looking at nature, human nature relationships. So I thought that was very, very provocative, because I'd never thought of it that way before. But I stopped thinking the way that most of my contemporaries who are working in the field of AIDS activism were working, because I was working directly with clients, and I was working very much with belief systems that people had, and who the authority was. Is it the guy in the white coat with all these lab tests who are giving me this who are giving dire predictions, and these are the drugs you have to take, and you're going to die anyway, so it doesn't really so it doesn't really matter what you do. This kind of almost sounded to me like a very hostile kind of hostility, because sometimes the bad news was often delivered by a doctor with a smile on their face. And I was witness to this, and I heard so many of the clients that I was working with, as well as the friends that I was offering support, that there was so many mixed messages being given. And of course, this is exactly what the relationship between the virus and the host is all about. It's about these kinds of paradoxes and tensions, and camouflage and disguise and mixed messages. And the host is, I think the immune system is so complex that we can't even begin to imagine how complex it is. And this is what I believe she's pointing out, that it is not, and I think most of the field of immunology is usually using war metaphors. It's about cutting it out or bombing it, and protecting the status quo. And I think her way of investigating and inquiring into something like the immune system is much more musical. It's much more, less about defending territory, defending identity, much more about making sense in a neighborhood. And you know, seeing if I can dance, if we can find a rhythm. So that's what's being, so your reading I thought was really lovely, and it sort of invited me to enter into the weave of Haraway's very complex way of thinking. And also what benefits I've derived as I dropped my military metaphors, as I was working in a community under stress and started to inquire at a deeper level with my clients and a kind of curiosity rather than responding in a paranoid attack mode. And, you know, I believe that there were benefits that everyone, I think it strengthened everyone's immunity, actually. We got much more resilient rather than, because paranoia serves nobody, really. I think it just increases, you know, a downward spiral when people get frightened or paranoid or feel like they're being punished. And start to recognize, okay, there's a double message here. So that's an invitation to be curious about this paradox that we're entering into together. And I also was curious about your, you mentioned ecofeminism, and you had doubts about that was the right word to use. And so if you feel comfortable about opening that up further, I would be really curious if there's anything more about that you'd like to share. So thank you.
I think, thank you for your comments, everybody. Maybe I'll just start with, just by saying that my only comments on the ecofeminism question from John was that I'm not objecting to the idea of a feminism which comes out of a consideration of ecology. It's more the specific politics around ecofeminism as a particular specific movement or moment in feminist history that was, you know, sort of came out of the sort of 70s feminism, and is not, well, one of the criticisms of it is that it's gender essentialist, and that the dichotomy between the genders is very strict and pronounced, and it doesn't, and even sort of later on in the sort of 90s, it doesn't consider intersectionality as being a consideration in its feminism. So I completely believe that, you know, ecology and feminism belong together. I just wanted to sort of separate it out a little bit, separate the threads maybe, and think about ecology through Haraway and through Haraway's ideas of you know, multi-species becoming and being with, and solidarity and things like that. So, I mean, I think that's what I'd say about that. I mean, there are still kind of, I think, like Starhawk, one of the more famous ecofeminists who's still working today. I think I'm interested in her writing, in terms of ecology, particularly, obviously. But yeah, I kind of, anyway, we can talk about that maybe. In relation to the virus, I suppose it's, I don't know what you're specifically referring to. There is a chapter in Staying with the Trouble about, or maybe not a chapter, a section about viruses. What I was going to say was that I guess it's the idea of species, and that includes, you know, on a bacterial or viral or molecular level, as well as human, animal, you know, all these sort of different classes or species or whatever. I guess it's the idea of it's survival, right? So maybe it could be the consideration of a virus and a host. The relationship is just that both things are trying to survive. So it's not that a virus is maliciously trying to take over and kill someone. It's it's perhaps more of a survival scenario where it's, I don't know, I'm not really sure, I'm just kind of free associating a bit, but just because I was thinking about the idea of the relationships between things, which obviously is what we're talking about the whole time in this, and about how those relationships are less becoming, or should be considered to be less combative and more collaborative in their existence. So yeah, I mean, that's just a thought for now, but we can talk more.
That's a great thought. And you used another word, intersectionality. And I have a vague idea about what that is. Isn't that the word you use? Intersectionality. Because I've delved into feminist theory, and I know that that's something that's used quite a lot. And I sort of understand it as it's you know, everyone's very multi-layered and operating in many different kinds of systems simultaneously. And so as a gay person, you could be lesbian, you could be Jewish, you could be Black, you know, you can be have a degree or not, or you could be working in the service industry, or you could be a professor. I mean, those are the kinds of complex dynamics. Am I getting it right? Sort of? Yeah, okay.
I work with intersectionality in the context of disability, so because that's an area where increasingly one is looking at multiple oppressions, multiple power situations, and disability crossed with homosexuality or sexual orientation or whatever, so, or gender issues, so or race for that matter, which is another. So there are lots of in a way it's become, it's kind of academically it's treated as a separate field, but in fact it's the whole field, right? I remembered what I was going to say too. So in the way that we have with these Bateson discussions, where we kind of lay everything out and then we try and integrate it afterwards. So I remember now that when I was reading the chapter on Gregory Bateson's chapter on grace, and then Nora Bateson's chapter on knowledge and uncertainty. So I guess the predominant work that I've done academically for the last 10 years or more has been attempting to develop a kind of a process rather than a method, perhaps, for integrating research that includes artistic ways of doing things and scientific ways of doing things. And it's not an easy thing to do. And in a way, it's not easy because of what Nora Bateson talks about in her essay, where she's talking about uncertainty, and the whole process of linking the arts and the sciences as practice is fundamentally rooted in this uncertainty, because science gives you a kind of certainty. And even if an artistic practice within the world of artistic practice, I mean, the artistic practice itself is based on uncertainty, but there's a kind of a logic to the work in the art world, which has its own logic, but it's very, very different from the logics and the approaches that are used in science. And so bridging the two worlds is uncertain to the nth degree, as it were. It's an order of magnitude more complex and more uncertain than quote just doing art. I'm not trying to diminish what art does, but the cross link is between the two domains is very, very difficult, and you can't talk about methods. So Erin Manning, in one of her texts, talk about she has a presentation called Against Method. So because she's coming from a very similar kind of background of trying to link these two disparate domains. And of course, Gregory Bateson's chapter is indeed an attempt to grapple with some of these issues in looking at art. So he does it looking at art from a kind of scientific perspective, but there is a way where what he's doing is not entirely scientific in the classical sense, right? He's stepping outside the boundaries of what is normally done in science. So even though, and obviously the metalogs are an artistic form, there's an artistic way of investigating things. So Gregory Bateson, in the broader focus of his work, is actually putting into practice artistic practices within the scientific discourse in this integrative way. So, and of course, Nora Bateson, with her essays and poems, is doing something more intensely along the same lines. And so the other thing I think I wanted to say was this idea that, so I think it was in the beginning of the chapter. Gregory Bateson says, I shall argue that the problem of grace is fundamentally a problem of integration, and that what is to be integrated is the diverse parts of the mind, especially those multiple levels, of which one extreme is called consciousness and the other unconscious. For the attainment of grace, the reasons of the heart must be integrated with the reasons of the reason. And he quotes Pascal, who's one of my favorite French writers, philosophers, who says, le cœur a les raisons que la raison ne connaît point. So the heart has its reasons that reason cannot know, right? So I think he translates it a little bit differently, but that's the way I tend to think of it. And Nora Bateson talks about in her text, and it's interesting because in a way it's the sense even of the title of her book, Small Arcs in Larger Circles. She talks about how one has these fragmented ideas about the world, and one misses and misses the larger picture. So the small arcs within larger circles is, so the Gregory Bateson argues that the mind is structured in such a way that we can only see the smaller arcs and we can never fully see the larger circles. So this is the sort of fragmented idea about how we are built, and the difficulty we have, obviously, dealing with things at the system level in ways that, and Gregory Bateson has an argument that you can't do this at the systems level without bringing in the arts. You cannot do it unless you have an artistic practice, an artistic way of looking at the question, and not just a scientific analytical point of view. So this is profoundly promoting this idea that in order to do things properly, we have to reintegrate the arts as a practice into the science as a practice. And this is one of the things that but when I started doing this, I did it on a gut feeling to some extent. I didn't articulate it this way, and it's been a long struggle to try and figure out how to promote this point of view to, for instance, granting committees who don't understand why you would want to bring the arts into, or why would you mix scientific practice up with an artistic practice in order to do things. So this kind of issue is tricky, but both the chapters in a way help me untangle some of these issues in terms of articulating what is going on. And obviously Haraway is also dealing with these issues. I haven't read Haraway's book. I have it. I was able to read along because I have it, but I haven't actually, I've read sections of it, but I haven't read the whole thing. So it's I think it's a must read, but I will get there. But
Lucy, you also mentioned Starhawk. I remember her. I think I was reading her back in the 80s and the 90s. She definitely has a connection to the shamanic traditions, and she uses a lot of altered states of consciousness and trance work. But I haven't been following her in a very long time. So if there's anything that you want to share about her, I'd be very curious also. So.
I actually don't know what she's written recently. I don't follow her particularly closely. I'm most familiar with her Dream in the Dark, which is I think the one that most people have read. But just linking what you just said, your question, sorry, John, about Starhawk and well, more to do with altered states of consciousness, and what Geoffrey just said. I just wanted to sort of say a little bit about a project I'm working on at the moment, which is partly why I'm in this kind of unofficially, I've just realized why I'm in this group, is that I'm working on a small part, I'm working in a small part of a much bigger project, which is a European Research Council funded project that's been instigated by University College London between its anthropology department and the Slade, which is the School of Art, which is at UCL. So I've been invited as a artist curator, or curator artist, or just curator. They keep using the word artist to refer to me, which I'm not. So I've been invited as one of these artist curators of a group of 7 of us to work with 7 anthropologists from UCL to produce this project around the use of diagrams within art practice and artistic research, and diagrams within an anthropological context. And I think it's this kind of this process of trying to integrate one within the other through a technology which, at least on the surface, kind of unites these fields of research. So we've been paired up, and I'm paired with an anthropologist, and we're making diagrams of our collective, not our collective research, our separate research, and the points at which they intersect. And the point in which my research intersects with the anthropologist I'm working with is through the idea of altered states of consciousness, and the possibility or impossibility of trying to diagram what that as an experience. So this is a process which has been going on for about a year with more or less success. And part of this process is also her as an anthropologist performing an ethnographic study of the whole group, so of all 14 people, so 7 artists and 7 anthropologists. So she is also performing this this ethnographic study, and is therefore producing a diagram as a result of that, which I, as a curator, and then transposing onto an exhibition, onto a gallery space, in which we are going to produce somehow this exhibition of diagrams that come out of this kind of almost impossible process of kind of trying to integrate one conflicting or complementary or symmetrical method of research with another. So I'm not really sure how that's kind of relevant, but it just made me, it seemed like the appropriate point to bring it up, because and also kind of I guess a declaration of an interest that I'm working on, and how I sort of came to come to this group. But this is the exact point in which these things happen, is that these kind of slightly difficult ways of introducing one methodology to another. So yeah, I don't know if that's useful or interesting.
Oh, that's very interesting. So it's like introducing one methodology to another. And now this is just my riffing on this. For one methodology to get introduced to another methodology, there may need to be some trance work for that to happen. The participants, if they want to go to a deeper level, will have to let go of a lot of stuff that they think they already know, so that they can meet another person in another discipline, and then achieve something that's more than just interdisciplinary, but even transdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. And I think that's a fascinating connection, with a relationship between that kind of practice in academia and academic settings, and connecting to a public, a larger public, and maybe what's happening at the cellular level with the microbial world. These may be all, rather than military metaphors and hunkering down and trying to nuke the guy before he nukes you, we could start thinking in terms of aesthetic relationships. And definitely for me, trance work, and I've done a lot of it, has been a real opening to, alternate ways of knowing. And I believe I get a lot of the inspiration from Bateson and his epistemology. His orientation is epistemological. And how do we know what we know is his really big question. And how do we learn? And then how do we learn how we learn? And those are that I think is what it calls deutero learning. So that's fascinating. I think that's a really interesting, working with trance states and art and and achieving a kind of style, and how groups and people who get to know each other well create a style. And, you know, oh, and I have a friend who would really like this, and you bring that friend in, and then then there's another level that gets worked with, and the style can get even more interesting. And I think this is how schools of performance get started, and probably the way, you know, businesses get started, the way markets get started. It's this kind of, we get attracted to a certain style of presentation, or a certain style of a garment, or a certain way of being present. And I think those are the kinds of things that probably happen all the way up and all the way down, you know, in all of these different systems. So that's fascinating. But I think there's there's something about trance state which is intrinsically deconstructive. It takes things apart, and then hopefully you bring something together that's more coherent. And so I think it's a deconstructive and a reconstructive phase in good trance work. I think bad trance work is when people get deconstructed and never put anything back together again. That can be very bad. So those are just some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick comment, just to say that, yeah, one of the things you say about trance work being constructive and reconstructive, I think you said, and this is something that we've in this collaboration that we've talked about a lot, is and I might have mentioned it here before, I can't remember, is the idea of like crossing over a porous threshold, and what it is that you bring back with you when you come back. Would you bring back into your quote unquote regular life, or, you know, or regular state of consciousness, whatever that might be? What is it? How are you altered by that state? And so this is something that that we've been trying to diagram, because actually diagramming an altered state is actually almost an impossible thing. So the idea of like, so instead we've been thinking about this kind of crossing over, like a transmission or something, over and back and over and back, and how each time you are altered. So yeah, I if I've understood you correctly, yeah, I agree with you, and in that kind of interpretation of those sorts of states, definitely.
So just to come back to your discussion, Lucy, about diagramming. So I was approached a couple of weeks ago by a colleague who said, oh, there's this interesting work that's going on. Maybe we could do something along these lines, which is using maps to look at literature. So, and it turns out, well, this is another area like quantum poetics, where I did work 30 years ago, did nothing with it, and now it's a domain of literature where people are looking and untangling these issues about how do you form maps out of literature. So we're looking into doing a project on this that would draw on some of the early work, unpublished work I did on this. But it's not quite the same thing that you're talking about, Lucy, but it is related in some sense. So sort of, I mean, I think the work on mapping, I've looked at some of the literature on it for, I mean, the scientific literature, not the, anyway. And it's quite heterogeneous in terms of how this is done. It can be very, very different ways of doing it. But I had looked into you know, just how do you form maps from literary descriptions of things, and this kind of issue. And I have actually done quite a lot of work on this, but in bits and pieces over the years. So there was a time in my career when I looked at when we looked at something called pivot representations, which are, because the way one talks about space in language is very different from the way one talks about space, or one represents space in graphic form. And so we came up with the idea that in order to transfer from a linguistic description to a graphic description, or vice versa, you needed a bridging representation that included elements from both sides of the problem. So we looked at different ways of building a bridging representation and did some work on that. And looking at spatial contexts in language. So how does language talk about space or incorporate mechanisms for dealing with space? And there were various forms of that. Typically, people look at prepositions, and prepositions is certainly one way that's done, but adjectives can have spatial information in them, nouns can have spatial information in them, and of course, sentences can have spatial information in them. So there's a lot of different ways that you can deal with space in this way. Anyway, so that's so it might be interesting, Lucy, at some point to actually exchange some of the work that you've done and some of the work that we're doing in this, because it might be mutually beneficial. What was the other thing I wanted to come back to? I wanted to ask you, John, about trance. So when you talk about trance work, what exactly are you referring to? I'm not familiar with the term.
There are many different schools of thought, and it goes right back to Mesmer and Genet and Passegur, I believe his name was.
So it's trance?
Trance, Trance.
Okay.
And it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I like to think of it as a intense learning state. You could say there's the low-level trance of watching TV, and there's the high-level trance of a conductor getting ready to do the Ninth Symphony. You don't do that consciously. You are relying upon lots of practice, and that practice has become so much a part of the person that they're not thinking about it. And I think this is what Bateson is looking at. And I think there are other practitioners or other thinkers about this. If you've learned any skill at a high level, once you've learned how to ride a bike, you don't think about riding a bike ever again. You just hop on and go to the store. And same thing with driving a car. You can leave your destination. You can leave the place you have your work and you're going home, and you can take the route that you always take, and you can play something on the radio and you have a conversation with a friend while you're driving, and then the next thing you know, you're at home and you're getting out of the car, and you don't have any idea about how you did any of that. But you did all these very complicated maneuvers through traffic, very novel situations, but you had enough skill so that you were able to make that happen. And so I think that's what he's saying basically, is if it's something that's really requires, you don't want someone to be driving a car consciously. That's the best way to have a wreck. And I think the same thing happens when we're communicating effectively with other people. There's, I think the language games we employ, we have ideas, they may be vague, they may be clear to us, but there's a lot of nonverbal communication happening. It's not in the digital part of the communication, it's in the nonverbal part. That's usually where people feel like they can trust, or they distrust, or they're cautious, or they're expansive. Has a lot to do with the nonverbals. And I think this is what trance pays exquisite attention to. It's you're with another person, you're watching their breathing, you're listening for the tone of their voice, you're sort of opening up to that person as there's a field that you and this person are participating through. And I think this has a relationship with what you were working with this last summer, with quantum poetics. And I think that is drawing upon that kind of relationship to the field. And you're in that field with another person, and you're opening up to a kind of mutuality. And a potential poem can emerge out of that. So I think those are high-level trance states, because there's an element of mystery, but it's not all just flying by the seat of your pants. There's some principles there, and there's also been a lot of practice. So I think this is the really good quality improvisational musicians. You'll see them get together and they'll turn something stunning, a stunning performance, but they've had a lot of practice. They've listened to one another. They know when a solo is going to happen. They know when to support another musician's solo. So I think these are the kind of things that he's focusing on when he's talking about a state of grace, which is something that animals have already, but we humans have to really rehearse it. It's really hard to be graceful. You know, you look at the ballerina on top, you know, how she pulls that off. But she's done a lot of bar exercises, you know. She's worked really hard to make it look so easy. And I think that idea of the cognitive unconscious is so powerful too in Bateson's work. I think what people now are calling the cognitive unconscious, because it's not, the conscious mind can't get it, but the unconscious gets quite a bit. And it's not like it's a top-down sort of relationship. I think this is what he criticizes Freud for, thinking that the conscious mind is on top, the unconscious mind is this swirling, strange, scary stuff underneath that has to be trained or dominated. And I believe he's moving, and I think Freud was a very bad hypnotist, and because he's extremely authoritarian. But someone like Milton Erickson or Bateson or Mead, they all studied trance work. I think, were moving it into a kind of relationship like this. So it was the conscious and the unconscious are partners in an aesthetic relationship, rather than combative, one on top of the other. I think this has vast lived significance. When a person can live in a kind of appreciation for the paradoxes and the impasses and the conflicts, and rather than retreat into a top-down, I'm the conscious mind on top, and I'm going to train these forces in an aggressive way. I think that's where Bateson he thought that was very ugly, actually. I think he had a very an aesthetic, it offended him aesthetically, I think, because he considered that very ungraceful. Anyway, those are just I hope that was answer some of your question. I'm sorry I got a little long-winded, but trance is a very deep and difficult subject, and I'm totally fascinated by these potentials that I think and I also think good trance work is probably the only way we're going to be able to survive. Because we can't do it with our conscious minds. Our conscious minds have fucked up really badly our environment. So I think this being able to enter into the weave and appreciate that we're in complex symbiotic relationships, I think it's going to take enough people to really be paying exquisite attention to dream and reverie and trance and mythopoetics. So thank you very much for asking that question. I love that.
So it never fails that when we start to talk about trance or dream states or the liminal zones that I enter into that state automatically. And that goes back to language. And yeah, if you have a chance, Lucy, maybe browse around the quantum poetics that might give you a feel for the field that we're embracing here. But yeah, grace and the bridging between two separate fields, or arts and sciences, an anthropological perspective and an artist perspective. I liked how you used that, the top cognitive shift that Bateson was doing, and that gives us that space there. But it's also, in a lot of ways, it's not able to be mapped. It's not something you can place on a diagram, because it's the ever shifting ecosystem, the ecology. And if we go back to Donna Haraway, she uses critters. I like how she uses the term critters. Not a friendly dog that's hanging out with you. It's also the microbes and the viruses within your own body. She also mentions the coral reefs and the vast ecosystems within there. And there's just uncertainty about how to proceed with a certain mapping. So the coral reefs, for example, I did a little research and noticed that at different epochs in time, there was mass extinction of the coral reefs, up to 50, 60, 70% at some eras for epochs. And we're entering into where we have the control. We have control of language. We have control of destruction of certain ecosystems. We don't have control over all the little critters, of course. Many have control over us, but it's not solely about control. And as we've mentioned, we can't grasp we're just a small little arc. We can't grasp the entire circle. But the trance states allow us to perhaps perceive the various concentric circles or just that zone mentality. There's something there, and yeah, I like I think you quoted Bateson. It says the problem of grace is fundamentally a problem of integration. So how do we integrate all of this, or find a stopping point so we can end our project or end our sentence as we see fit?
I'm glad you used that word integration, because I think that's one of the words I was looking for. Because it's not just about going into trance, it's about integrating those trance states. And that's that reconstructive phase. It's so important. I think he's saying the unaided conscious mind is at risk, but with dream and metaphor and story, that aspect of our nature can coordinate these, vast communication systems, and I think we can, but we have to learn their language. We can't expect them to learn our language at the conscious level. But our intentions and the questions that we ask are very, very important to the ecology. So, we have an intention, and we're clear about our intention. We can, and the conscious mind, the linguistic mind is a partner here. So I think it goes back to that loose, strict kind of thinking, and we need both. And because we don't want to throw out, the conscious mind, because it's extremely important. We wouldn't learn anything without it. I'm just going to quote one passage, because I think this is sort of, he says about disease and the idea of the short-term focus of fighting a disease process. He says, A bag of tricks for curing or preventing a list of specified diseases provides no overall wisdom. The ecology and population dynamics of the species has been disrupted. Parasites have been made immune to antibiotics. The relationship between mother and neonate has been almost destroyed, and so on. I think that last part, he must be coming from, I know that, I think it was in the 50s when mothers were separated from their infants in hospitals, and, you know, infant crib death, you know, was sometimes attributed to that. The child was, it comes out of the womb and there's that separation. The baby will go into panic until it reaches the mother's breast, and then the baby will immediately chill out and relax and enter into that symbiotic bond with mother that it had in the womb. She will have that outside of the womb because there will be bonding. Take the baby and put it in a crib in another room, the baby goes into shock. And I think these are the kinds of horror stories. We think about that. It's probably still going on, unfortunately. But these are the kind of interruptions that, in the drive for efficiency, you know, and eliminating disease, there's not much wisdom in that, because it can upset all of these very fragile coalitions, you know, that have been, and the mother's acquired immunity, she can pass that on to her infant, and then the baby develops its own immunity through its experience. But I think that the mother's milk is very important. That immunity that the mother has, that she can't pass that on through a formula in a bottle. So I think these are the kind of things he's pointing out. And I think he and Mead were probably considered wacko. That they thought these things were important. But I think we've all re-educated ourselves, because I see mothers nursing in public with, you know, totally comfortable about it, which is unthinkable 30 years ago.
It's still going on that even at the hospital, you have to request to have your child right there with you immediately. Like, for the unknowing mother or mother-to-be or family-to-be, if you didn't know about this request, at least here in America or perhaps just Kentucky, your child will be taken away, hung upside down, made to cry, measured, and then perhaps given back to the mother if they're conscious enough to take care of it. But the direct, like, we had to request that, and even after we requested it, we had to remind them. I've never been so primally enraged, except in that moment when my child was taken away to be measured. I was like, no, that's not what we talked about here. And it's very, yeah, exactly what you talked about there. There's the necessity of that, and it's still going on in our society.
So you had to be very vigilant in protecting your child from that, what I consider very abusive. And congratulations that you made that something that was very important, because I think a lot of alienation occurs when we're very, very young. And I think it doesn't go away. And I think that's where these kind of practices that are so short-sighted and lack wisdom, I think this is what Nora and Gregory were very, very attuned to. It's slippery. It's very slippery, because you're in these institutions that have these practices hardwired in their system, and you're a pest if you demand that they change their routine or pay attention in a different way. I've worked in hospitals. I speak from personal experience.
It's funny that we're talking about it right now. I'm very shaken up about that experience, even though it wasn't traumatic for me and nothing major happened. But nothing makes me more angry than a set system imposing values that I know are false. I think I mentioned during the Aaron Manning discussion, the simple email exchange that turned into me nearly getting fired just because I couldn't directly communicate with someone I have a great relationship with. And I broke the state's protocol of how an email should work. And I got written up twice for it. But yeah, I'll refrain from that. I'm a little bit worked up just thinking about it, but there does need to be, so my conscious mind educated itself for these unknown states or forgotten states in our society. Something as simple as childcare or letting the mother hold a child is forgotten and still forgotten. It's good that breastfeeding and other basic care is being promoted nowadays, but that's just one step towards massive issues. I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Doug, for sharing that. I worked with the elderly too. A lot of the treatment of the elders, especially if they have like dementia, it's really horrifying. And I'm talking about people who are really wealthy and who are state-of-the-art organizations. But the terrible things are happening in those places. And I was advocating on the behalf of, I would have a client and I would go into their living arrangements and I would just notice things that were inappropriate, like shit on the floor or on the bed. It's like, excuse me, where did this come from? And we're talking about very, very expensive, $10,000 a month kind of arrangements. And people are being treated that way. And so I would immediately report to the family, and the family I would just document what I saw, and the families would then take it from there. So I was a free agent in the sense that I was working for the client and working for the family rather than working for the institution, because if you work for the institution, you will lie about anything to protect the institution. That's what I found out. And it's extremely corrupt and very frustrating, as you say. It's how do you interact with integrity in a system which is basically about making money and the highest profit they can with the lowest amount of and they make everything look pretty on the surface, but I think those kind of things that are happening, I had to train myself how to stay very present and not get into a persecution mode or try to get pissed off at someone on the staff, because I knew they were just doing what they were told to do. But I think those double messages that are in the system, if you have someone around who can watch carefully those double messages, and that was sort of what my job was in those circumstances, I could sort of like be a detective, and I could sort of assist in a very, some ways dramatically. I think I saved some people's lives because I blew the whistle. But I could only do that because I was protected. I couldn't do that if I was an employee of an institution. So it's tricky.
Yeah, definitely tricky. Tricky is a good word. Without going into further rage, or whatever you want to call my version of rage. I'd like to introduce Mary Catherine Bateson, who was very connected to her own mother, who advocated for the strong bond between mothers and grandmothers, and but she introduces in one of her books, the name is slipping my mind, but the older, or the new stage in between this elderhood that you're talking about, that's being thrown into the nursing home environment away from families. And so a little bit younger, after perhaps the retirement age, is this new elderhood that's forming. That's maybe second stage adulthood. I can't remember how they phrase it or how she phrases it. And I'm very interested in how that generation, that classification or stage of life is going to reach back and influence and be the elders of society. I have personal examples of people that I see, the Friends group I'm with, the Quakers. There are quite a bit that are retired that have the time away from the 9-to-5 type of job or just the work mentality, and they're dipping back into projects that can really make a difference in society. So I'm interested how all that will tie into these various bridgings as well.
I wanted to think a little bit about stuff that's sort of hard to think about, but I'm talking about trance and altered states of consciousness and conscious mind, the unconscious, the cognitive unconscious. And we're really blessed that, I'm really blessed that I don't need to know about my liver or my stomach or my hormones or any of that. I can inform myself about, you know, some herbs that may be beneficial, and I can take those herbs, or I can watch my diet, or I can exercise. But you know, if I reach for an apple and bite it, and it digests somehow, and I don't know how that happens. It's an extremely efficient process. But I think this whole idea of, I'm just sharing something that, a really odd story by Bernard Cheek. He was a doctor, and he was a gynecologist, and he worked with trance work. And a patient presented her problem. Her problem was that she couldn't get pregnant, and she wanted to get pregnant. And he basically put her into a light trance, and he asked her, unconscious, to find the source for this infertility. And she was able to verbally report that when she was in utero, her mother had tried to abort her with a hat pin. And the doctor thought that was absurd, because he knew that, you know, an embryo is not conscious and couldn't make those kind of discriminations. But he later got a letter from this patient's mother, and the mother indeed admitted that that had been the case, that she had tried to abort her. So the doctor created a lot of cognitive dissonance because he realized his theories about how humans work were, you know, he had to look at this evidence as real evidence for something that he could not fit into his scheme. So he changed. Benefit that he was that flexible. A lot of practitioners are not flexible at all. And I think that we're starting to realize, since the Human Genome Project was heralded as going to be such a huge breakthrough, and it was a breakthrough, because it really taught a lot of people that what they had thought the human genome was, they were wrong about it. And that there's a lot that's going on, the epigenetic, the environment, that there isn't a top-down relationship between gene and cell, that there's that the cell is swimming in a sea of information, and that can change which genes get expressed, depending on what's in the environment that would allow that gene to get expressed. So I think that's a change that's happening in the way we think about genetics as we move away, I think, from that top-down kind of model that, you know, we learned with Crick and Watson back in the 50s. that we're starting to learn that a lot of this material that they thought was just junk DNA, had no function at all, we're starting to realize has a lot of information. So I think it's not too far-fetched to use that musical metaphor, that there's the DNA, the RNA, there's a translation, and maybe a transmission that happens. And you know, the good news is, if you may have a fat cell, you may have a fat gene, but if you live in an area where, you know, there's only vegetables, root vegetables, and a little bit of grain to eat, you're not going to get fat. You have to, but if you're in the Mediterranean culture, and you know there are lots of fats and, you know, carbs, and you can eat all you want to, then that fat gene is going to have an environment to express itself in. So I think that's what we're starting to learn, is that we are these very complex and adaptive systems, and we are working really beautifully most of the time. But I think, you know, I think we have to sort of temper our enthusiasm to, you know, overuse antibiotics, overuse, you know, surgery, separate mothers from infants. So I think we have a long way to go, I think, before we get use all of our knowledge and use all of it well. But I think that maybe I'm recently reading a philosopher of science. I can't remember his name right now. Oh yeah, this guy, Paul Feyerabend, that he's written something called Science as Art, which I've not read yet. But I think he's very open to a different kind of science, which is much more aesthetically, you know, works more with aesthetics than the kind of science that you know, we were taught when I was taught in high school, which a lot of it is now looks very, very crude, kind of neoliberal, top-down management style, and basically supporting institutions that want to make money. So we have a long way to go, but I think that Bateson and Nora, I think, are sort of creating a kind of niche for us to think about how we could create safe containers for these kinds of explorations and possible experiments between science and art. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
So I something you said, Johnny, you said practitioners can be very rigid, or it wasn't something like that you said. And I agree. It's funny because I work with a lot of, because I'm in the area of rehabilitation and disability, there are a lot of physiotherapists and occupational therapists. These are practitioners. They work in the clinic with people, and you know, I have nothing to say about, you know, there's a lot of pluses that go with those practices, but I also find, and you know, I've worked in the past with other practitioners in other areas, forestry and things like that, that people, certain individuals who are practitioners can get very locked into a very narrow perspective on things. I just say it's like that they have learned the theory that sits underneath their practice. They learned it in school, but they in Gregory Bateson's terms, they sank it down to be bedrock. The problem, of course, is that these theory on which these things are based in are often old theories that have now been questioned and rechallenged. But certain groups of practitioners have never gone back to re-examine these foundational issues and have gone on applying them for their whole careers without necessarily understanding. And what the Batesons do, because they emphasize this idea of learning to learn. So this idea that so by jumping from one discipline to another, this is something that I've found in my own practice as a scientist, because I've jumped so many times from one discipline to another. Every time you jump to a new discipline, and you start talking with people, and you start talking about your old disciplines, you have to bring the stuff that's sunk down to the surface and re-examine it in order to be able to talk about your discipline to somebody else. And so it's when you jump disciplines, you're forced to re-question the boundaries, the basics that you sank down. So this is when he talks about the things that change and the things that are fixed. And I don't know how we can, I think part of the problem that we have with the world today is there are an awful lot of people who are in the one modality and not enough in the other, in the sort of more flexible. I mean, there are lots of people. I'm not saying that it's only a few individuals that are jumping fields and doing interesting things. There are lots of them. But I think there are a lot more of the other kind. It would be nice to figure out a way to, I don't know.
I think it's a mechanical sort of training they have. It comes out of a very mechanistic way of looking at the body. And so they do, okay, let's do 10 of those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's do 5 of these, 1, 2, 3, and it's just, it's sort of like rote training. And I found that it is effective for some things. That's perfect. But also for some things, there's all kinds of subtleties that, are going to be missed. I remember I used to do Reiki. It's sort of a therapeutic touch kind of thing. It's very, very subtle, light touch. Sometimes you don't need to touch at all. It's just like a current, like chi, like in Tai Chi. You can just feel this current flowing. And, you could sense where the energy is blocked, where it's open. But I remember going into a hospital setting, and I was working with a person that I knew really well, who I'd worked with for a while, so he was very familiar with this. And he was having a great time as the energy was flowing. And the nurse came in, and I immediately got very self-conscious. And she said, "Oh, that's okay. I do Reiki too," she whispered. She said, "Don't let me bother you. I'll come back later." I thought, wow, how many nurses and massage therapists and occupational therapists who have to present a certain style. But underneath all of that, they may be practicing some healing art, and that they really want to share with their patients, but they have to do it surreptitiously, or when all the lights are out, or when the supervisor isn't watching. So I started to appreciate how complex it is, because as an outsider, I could come into the system and work directly with anyone who wanted me to work. We could make that arrangement. But even as an outsider, I still felt the pressure of the system and how you have to conform to a kind of code. And but I do think that if you can bring in those healing arts, meditative kind of trance states, which really rely upon aesthetics and the quality of attention, the quality of relationship, and even other kind of procedures which might be invasive can be, dealt with and tolerated. And people do recover faster from surgeries if they've had someone there who's very tuning into them, these kind of subtle kind of levels. So, but it was very hard for me to work in some of those environments. And so I'm hoping we can continue to persevere and use all of our knowledge and use all of it well. because I'm not advocating a kind of new agey kind of glibness about, you know, because I think there's a lot of subtlety and that we could be tapping into, because I've seen the benefits and I've seen the people enter into visionary episodes. I mean, they will report something of great significance to them that happened, and they would often ask me, well, how did you do that? What was that? And I went, I don't know. I really don't know. It really has nothing to do with my ego or anything I planned, any kind of treatment plan I came up with. It's just being open to this subtle current that's flowing between just about everything that's alive. This current is flowing through us, prana, chi, whatever you want to call it. So I think these are mysteries that we're just starting to open up to. Hopefully there will be a new science that will emerge out of these kinds of different kind of practitioners bringing this into their maybe traditional workplaces, but they've been opened up and become more sensitive, and they're going to want to practice at a deeper level than they're being allowed to. So I think that we should expect that there's going to be some reorganizations happening if we're going to flourish.
I don't know how my thought process will tie into all this, but going along with what you, Geoffrey, and Johnny are saying about kind of the expertise or the experts getting trapped in their own frameworks, or even how do the smaller group of us
Doug, you froze. Can you hear us? Hello, Doug. Can anyone hear him? I can't hear him. Well, while he rejoins us, I was wondering if you would talk about logics some more, Geoffrey. You mentioned something about different logics. I know that's sort of a big topic, but I think that Bateson is going to be going into this area in the next couple of chapters. And I believe this was something that he was very challenged by, because I think the sort of the kind of formal logic that he was, that I think a lot of these failing institutions were failing because of the logics that they were using, or the trying to impose one logic on a system that was operating with a different kind of logic. So I'm very drawn to paraconsistent logics and intuitive logics. Someone like, I think it's, I can't remember his name, Graham Priest. It sort of interests me. So the opposite of false is not necessarily true. And I think that's what Bateson was appreciating, that that there's the digital mind, which works with it's true or false, but there's that nonverbal that can register oppositions and impasses and conflicts. Like in our first conversation, I think I sort of looked at how a person can give a double message like I love you. So there's the verbal content, I love you, and then there's the nonverbal. And you put that together, I love you. That's, I think, an example of a kind of different kinds of logics. The verbal is expressing something, and the nonverbal is, if not opposed, it's offering a para-message or a different message. So you're getting these multiple messages. So I don't know if that stirs up any interest, but I think that's one of the things that fascinates me most about Bateson, because I think he, and I think Nora does too, they're very sensitive to these very subtle and sometimes not so subtle nonverbal communiques, which I think are very field-based. I think they're very connected to the field. Anyway.
Sure, I could talk a little bit about it, but as you said, it's a very big field. I have done a little bit of work with logics, but I've done most of the work I've done is on reasoning. And reasoning is the larger domain within which logic sits. That is to say, logics are usually formal systems. They're kind of, I mean, there is a question about logic of closed worlds versus logic of open worlds. But even logic of open worlds is very formal. So it's rules about how you combine statements in order to make deductions within the logic system, right? So it's not something that really interests me a lot. I kind of, a little bit like you, I'm a bit fascinated by the idea of logics, but most of the work I've done has been with reasoning and the process of reasoning in ways that are not necessarily confined to a strictly formal approach, or that may be formal but within formal systems that are not quite so constrained as a logic system. So for instance, I've done studies of reasoning about space using, so with a mathematical linguist collaborator, we developed some reasoning ideas about reasoning about perceptual spaces using some formalisms, but within a larger context, within a broader context. So this is not so much about truth or false as it is about combining information in one area with information in another way, in ways, in kind of analogical ways almost. But so I'm not sure that I can say a lot. I mean, I've done a fair amount of work on it over the years, but it's not quite what you're asking, you know, which is a kind of a different area. And in a way, the work on mapping of literature is related, because one is attempting to formalize information about space that's in a literary text in a way that you can represent it and that is a kind of reasoning. And it's a kind of reasoning that is metaphorical and symbolic in some sense, because when you're trying to capture what's going on in a literary text, you're looking at teasing out the symbolic or metaphorical content of the literature and including that into the maps. So it's a way of doing something a little bit more metaphorical with a kind of formal system. So in that sense, I think that maybe interests me more than the sort of because when you look at logics as per se, you're right. You're essentially working at how to update the formal rules in order to get a little bit more expressive power out of them. But it's very mathematical, you know, very kind of constrained way of looking at the world, and the sort of looking at the way you would reason about something is more these sort of heuristics, if you like, rather than formal rules, you know.
Right.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, because I think there can be rules and you can break rules, but also when you're in complex, unstable systems, rules don't work. So you need principles rather than rules when you're in a very unstable complex system.
Right. But
And
logics
this is what
don't,
Bateson appreciated.
yeah, but logics don't work in those kinds of systems. I mean,
Right.
logics are closed in a sense. They're closed by their syntax and grammar and the things that you're allowed to state and the things that you're not allowed to state in logic has nothing to say about it. It can only say things about things it's allowed to state. That's part of the way it works, you know, so it's very close.
Yeah, and I think there's a trance logic that comes out of Bateson's work. A fellow named Gilligan, Stephen Gilligan, and I worked with him, and he would do very simple things. Like a person would talk about, I'm afraid of this. They talk about what they're afraid of. And he would just say, I sense that you are afraid. And I can also sense that you are courageous. You can be afraid and you can be courageous at the same time, which is definitely a trance logic. It's not an either or kind of logic, it's a both and kind of logic. And that tends to invite people to be more receptive to something that's other than afraid. So it's not about, we're not rejecting your fear, we're just adding something to it. And I think this is complementary. We're adding something that's complementary to it. But I think that's fascinating use of language. And it's a very poetic use of language, I think.
And there is a kind of logic that's kind of interesting, which is called the many worlds interpretation in quantum mechanics, but it's the logic that incorporates many worlds. Right. So in a way, it's each of the worlds are closed, but since you can have an infinite number of these many worlds, and each has their own logical formalisms, there you can have the one thing and its opposite, because they exist in different worlds, and there's this relationship between the worlds that you can construct. So that's a kind of a formal way to work with these kinds of things. It's kind of an interesting one too, you know, because it relates to parallel universes and
very interesting, and wormholes and all that,
and Dick's work, Philip Dick's work, you know, and all this kind of in literature and so forth. So.
Well, welcome back, Doug.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm on my phone, so if I receive a call, then I'm kicked off, and that was an important call, sorry.
Did you want to complete that thought? You were in the middle of something.
Well, I think it's still tying in with what the two of you were talking about. You mentioned Paul, right?
Feyerabend. Yeah.
Feyerabend?
Feyerabend, this sign, yeah.
Right. Didn't he do against method?
Yes.
Which goes against the scientific method, but he uses the term epistemological anarchy, I think, to describe kind of that non-hierarchical, just there is no method to the madness, but there is we can look at science and see that, well, here we are talking on a phone. I could walk around and talk to you guys if I wanted to, and you're in different countries, locations. So, but the scientific method isn't necessary for that. And I think I mentioned to Johnny the other day that I saw the Balinese as anarchic in a certain way, that anticlimactic, the climb to the top is a form of anarchy, at least in certain anarchic circles. I'm just now learning about anarchy from one of David Graeber's papers, fragments of anarchic anthropology, I think. But that was an eye-opener for me on, it ties in loosely with the structures we have, like co-op structure, horizontal management, what we're talking about here, that there is no one expert, or if there is an expert, they're missing out the 9 trillion other possibilities that could be happening. But that doesn't mean destruction or dismantling or constant sticking it to the man, whatever you want to say. It's using that as a ground for proceeding, perhaps. Like I said, it's a new territory for me, so I'm it's one I'm very interested in, and taking it from an anthropological perspective with the Balinese. And Gregory is also an anthropologist, and he explores different cultures. And just wanted to say it's interesting, and I thought it tied into what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we're moving between different disciplines, and I think that the patterns that connect can be our focus. We can be more resourceful and more skillful in the context that we find ourselves in. And I think I think Nora's talking about, did she say transcontextual? I think she uses that expression. But there's this context, there's that context, there's that context, there's this. So there are these different contexts, but there's something in between all of these contexts that can be relevant, so that you're not just starting all over. And this is something that, a story that I recall, Milton Erickson, famous, he was a psychiatrist, but he was also a hypnotherapist, and he trained Bateson, Gregory, and Margaret Mead in hypnosis. And they marveled at the kind of cases that he was able to have an influence on. I remember one, and I think that this sort of illustrates his ability to use context. A man who was drinking too much. He was like alcoholic. He came in for therapy, and after getting the man's story, I think he put him into a trance. I'm not sure, but he gave him a message, and he said, "You can drink all you want, but you can't drink at the same bar. So if you want to drink another drink, you have to go to another bar. And you can drink as much as you want, as long as you drink at a different bar." So that was his instruction. And evidently Erickson had a lot of force. He was very forceful and very commanding presence, and people did what he wanted them to do. But the guy, he came back a couple of months later, had lost a lot of weight. He wasn't drinking anymore. And he told him, he said, "Well, I had one drink, and then I would walk to another bar and have another drink. And then walking to another bar, I started to become very conscious of what I was doing. And he ended up getting a lot more exercise than he had, and it sort of stopped his pattern of unconscious drinking." And I think that that was just a brilliant intervention. And it may not work for anybody but that particular client that he had. But I think it was an excellent example of being able to change the context of the symptom. So instead of saying what many people said, "You drink too much, stop drinking," he said, "Drink all you want, but you can't do it in the same location. You have to change your location." And by interrupting his habitual pattern, he changed the pattern. So that the man then had to examine his behavior in a way that he would not have been. So in a sense, the client was going meta. He was taking a meta perspective on his own behavior in a way that a prohibition, just stop drinking, just would not have worked. So I think that's a fascinating example of how we can assist ourselves and assist others in changing these, hardwired behaviors that we know aren't good for us. And I think that's the challenge, because we're living in a culture where there's so many opportunities to get addicted to something. And, we may get thirsty. Instead of drinking water, we'll drink Coca-Cola or a beer, and so those may be things that we want, but they're not necessarily things that our body needs. And I think these are the kind of, these can be, if we're just going for what we want rather than for what our bodies needs, we actually can create an enormous imbalances. And when I speak from personal experience, I know that the things that I get addicted to, I can't just have one. Actually, I don't think I have addiction. I have like certain compulsions. If I don't touch it, I don't feel like I need it. But if I do, and I start to eat it, I get hooked into that habitual habit, So it's very tough to break these things.
So we're at the
Who are you referring to there? Sorry, I was asking Johnny real quick. Who was the reference you were talking about?
Oh, it was
Bateson worked with there.
Milton Erickson, who's taught Bateson and Margaret Mead. He taught them hypnosis, so they were following his guidelines and how he worked with trance, which is a very unique and very permissive and non-authoritarian way of working, actually. But I think it fits also with what Lucy was talking about, this interdisciplinary kind of, how do we enter into relationships with experts in other fields, and how can we ask them questions that are useful? So that's an ongoing theme.
So we're at the end of 2 hours. I guess, Lucy, you decided to give your voice a rest, which was probably a good idea.
Yeah, I'm really croaky.
Feel better. Feel better. Real soon.
For next week, so I made I screwed up. I skipped a text in my planning. It happened because I have an electronic version of the book, and the text was a bit confused in the table of contents. So I skipped over the first text in the next section, which is this thing on deutero learning, I think.
Yeah.
Which is not in the schedule, and it's a fairly long piece, so I'm hesitant to include it in the next week's reading, because the next week reading, the opening chapter, is also quite long, so it would mean quite a lot of material to get through, and we had the meta as well. So I'm thinking that maybe I'll slide. I've looked at the schedule, and there's the week that we do double bind. The text on double bind is relatively short, so we could put in the Deutero learning one in parallel with that. I was slightly hesitant because of the reason I picked the reason I limited that week to one text is because I think the double bind text is really important, but I think we could probably get away with sliding in. And anyway, the double bind is such a common theme to all of Bateson's texts that I think we'll come back to it again and again. So I don't think we'll lose much by including a second text in that. So I'm proposing to skip the Deutero learning next week and deal with the, I can't remember what the next one, but I think it's the next.
It's the theory of play and fantasy.
The theory of play and fantasy, which I do think is very important on its own, and it's a somewhat different idea than the Deutero learning. So I think so I'll do that. I'll lead the discussion next week, and after that, I think we're into schizophrenia. Several papers on schizophrenia, which are also quite interesting. Is that amenable to folk? I'll also see if I can find I'll send a message to Ryan and see if we can find out what's going on, whether or not he can. Maybe he's not available, but encourage him anyway, because we do appreciate his voice in the discussion. So
thank you.
So thank you, Lucy, for introducing. It was a great introduction, and sort of set us onto a path, I guess.
Yes, and Doug, are we on for this afternoon? Did you say you had time?
Right. What time would work for you?
Whatever you want. You can message me. I don't know if you said you were available this afternoon or not.
Yeah, I'll send you a message here in just a minute.
Okay.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you next week.